When you've lived long enough, you think you know the limits of your heart, the boundaries of what you're allowed to feel. Then someone comes along and quietly shatters all of it. For me, that someone was a college boy, a young man who walked into my life unexpectedly and showed me a side of love I thought I'd lost forever. When Ethan walked into my gallery that morning, I didn't think much of it. He was just another bright-eyed college kid, eager to learn about art and the business that surrounds it. I'd seen a dozen like him over the years, interns who stayed a few months, helped arrange exhibitions, and moved on to chase bigger dreams. I didn't expect him to be any different. "Hi, I'm Ethan Collier," he said, his hand outstretched as he introduced himself. He had that polite energy you only find in the very young, self-assured, but with a flicker of nervousness beneath the surface. I shook his hand and gave him a quick smile before moving on to the next task. That was all he was supposed to be to me. A name, a passing face. Nothing more. I was wrong. There was something about Ethan that I noticed almost immediately, though I couldn't put my finger on it at first. He wasn't like most of the interns I'd worked with. There was no air of entitlement, no sense that he was just punching the clock. He was attentive, thoughtful, and curious in a way that felt rare. He listened when I spoke, asked questions that went deeper than surface-level chatter, and never acted like he already had all the answers. The first time I really saw him was during the second week of his internship. I'd given him the task of setting up a new sculpture display while I worked on the lighting in the adjacent gallery room. I expected him to need help or to interrupt me with questions, but he didn't. When I came back, the display was perfect, not just neat and symmetrical, but with a sense of artistry, like he'd understood what the piece needed to shine. "You've got a good eye," I said, genuinely impressed. He smiled a little shyly. "Thanks. I love working with sculpture. It's all about how the light hits it. Right?" I paused, surprised. "Exactly." That was the moment I realized Ethan wasn't just here for a line on his resume. He cared. Over the weeks, we fell into an easy rhythm. Ethan quickly became my go-to for handling delicate tasks or brainstorming ideas for upcoming exhibitions. He was smart, eager, and quietly confident. But more than that, he had a way of making people feel comfortable. Of making me feel comfortable, which was something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't until one particular afternoon that I realized how much I'd started to notice him. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some paperwork for an upcoming exhibition, when I caught him out of the corner of my eye. He was rearranging some canvases in the storage room, lifting them carefully as though they were made of glass. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing the lean muscles in his arms. His hair was slightly messy, the way it always seemed to be, and his expression was one of quiet focus. I watched him for longer than I should have. When he turned and saw me, I looked away quickly, pretending to be absorbed in my work. My face felt warm, and my stomach did a strange little flip. I told myself it was nothing, just a silly reaction to a handsome young man. But it didn't feel like nothing. As the weeks passed, I began to notice other things about Ethan. The way his laugh filled the room, warm and unself-conscious. The way he always seemed to know when I needed help without me having to ask. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about art, or when he listened to me talk about my own work. It wasn't just his looks that drew me in, though there was no denying he was attractive. It was the way he saw me. For years, I'd felt invisible. My divorce had left me feeling like I was walking through life in a fog, going through the motions without ever really being present. Even when people complimented my work or praised my gallery, it always felt hollow, like they were seeing the surface, not the person beneath. But Ethan saw me. He asked questions that no one else thought to ask. He noticed when I was having a bad day, or when I was proud of something I'd accomplished. He listened, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely cared. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan and I were alone in the gallery, rearranging a few displays for an upcoming exhibit. It was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness I usually loved, but that day it felt charged. We worked in silence for the most part, but every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me. His gaze wasn't intrusive. It was soft, curious, like he was trying to understand something about me, that I couldn't quite figure out myself. At one point, as we were moving a heavy sculpture into place, our hands brushed. It was such a small thing, barely worth noticing, but I felt it like a jolt of electricity. I froze for just a second, my breath catching in my throat. Ethan noticed. He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Everything okay?" he asked after a moment. "Fine," I said quickly, stepping back and brushing off my hands. "Let's keep going." He didn't push, but the moment stayed with me. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he smiled when he was excited about something. The way his eyes softened when he talked about his favorite artists. The way he made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore. I knew it was wrong. Ethan was young, nearly half my age. He deserved someone who could match his energy, someone who was in the same stage of life as him. I wasn't that person. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the harder it became to ignore the pull I felt toward him. The turning point came a few days later. It was late in the afternoon, and I was finishing up some paperwork in the back office when Ethan knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Do you need any help before I head out?" I looked up at him, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The light from the window caught his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the quiet warmth in his eyes. "No, I'm good," I said finally, forcing myself to look away. He hesitated, then smiled. "All right, see you tomorrow." As he turned to leave, I felt a strange pang of regret. I wanted to call him back, to say something, anything that would make him stay just a little longer. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there in the silence, feeling a weight in my chest that I couldn't explain. By the time I left the gallery that evening, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. I walked to my car slowly, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions I didn't want to face. And yet, as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. Ethan wasn't just another intern to me. He was something more. Sometimes, the heart betrays you before your mind even has a chance to protest. That's how it felt with Ethan, like my emotions had already taken the leap, and I was the one scrambling to catch up. After that quiet Saturday in the gallery, I tried to pretend that nothing had changed. But it had. Something unspoken had slipped into the spaces between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. Ethan seemed to sense it too, though he didn't say anything outright. It was in the way he lingered a little longer when we worked together, or the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It wasn't overt, but it was there, an invisible thread pulling us closer. One afternoon, I found him in the gallery storage room, cataloging a new shipment of paintings. He looked up when I entered, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Hey," he said, setting the clipboard down. "I was just about to come find you. I wanted to ask what you thought about this piece." He gestured toward a large abstract painting leaning against the wall. It was bold and chaotic, with streaks of red and black slashing across the canvas. I stepped closer, studying it. "It's intense," I said carefully. "Exactly," he replied, his voice brimming with excitement. "It's raw. It makes you feel something, even if you can't explain what it is. That's what I love about it." I turned to look at him, caught off guard by the passion in his voice. His eyes were shining, his enthusiasm infectious. "You really get this stuff, don't you?" I said softly. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I just see things differently." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched, charged with something I couldn't name. I felt his eyes on me, and when I met his gaze, my breath caught. It was just a look, simple, quiet, but it felt like he was peeling back every layer of me, seeing parts of myself I'd kept hidden for years. I broke the moment first, stepping back and clearing my throat. We should figure out where to hang that piece." Ethan nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fooled. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I replayed our conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every glance. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just lonely and reading too much into a harmless moment. But deep down, I knew better. The truth was, Ethan made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He reminded me of the person I used to be, the woman who laughed easily, who dreamed without limits, who believed in the beauty of life. I hadn't seen her in a long time. The following week, the tension between us continued to grow. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was there, quiet and insistent, like a song playing softly in the background. There were little moments that stuck with me, like the way Ethan's hand brushed against mine when he handed me a canvas, his touch lingering just a fraction too long. Or the way he smiled at me when I made a joke, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just attraction, it was the way he saw me, the way he made me feel like I wasn't just a name or a role. One evening, we stayed late at the gallery to prepare for an upcoming exhibit. The air was warm, the quiet hum of the city outside filtering through the open windows. Ethan was adjusting the lighting on one of the sculptures, his brow furrowed in concentration. I watched him for a moment, unable to stop myself. There was something so captivating about him. His ease, his confidence, the way he seemed to move through the world without hesitation. "Laura?" I blinked, startled. He was looking at me now, his head tilted slightly, a faint smile on his lips. "Sorry," I said quickly. "What is it?" "I was just asking if this looks right," he said, gesturing to the sculpture. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I stood beside him. He was so close I could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne filling the air. "It's perfect," I said softly. He turned to look at me, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt thick, charged with something neither of us dared to name. "Laura," he began, his voice low. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. "We should call it a night," I said, forcing a smile. "It's getting late." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, you're right." But as he turned to gather his things, I caught the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning. I told myself I was being foolish. Ethan was young, with his whole life ahead of him. He didn't need someone like me complicating things. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had already shifted. The breaking point came a few days later. It was a slow afternoon at the gallery, and Ethan and I were the only ones there. I was working on a new display, arranging paintings along the wall, when I felt him come up behind me. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice soft. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening. He was standing so close, his expression open and unguarded. "I think I've got it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't move. "Laura," I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I know this probably isn't the right time to say this," he said, his voice low and steady, "but I can't keep pretending I don't feel something for you." My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. "Ethan?" "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated, and I know you probably think this is a terrible idea. But I can't ignore it. I can't ignore you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was screaming at me to stop this, to draw a line before it was too late. But my heart was already moving toward him, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. "I feel it too," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Ethan's eyes softened, and for a moment everything else fell away. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady, and I didn't pull away. That night, I left the gallery feeling lighter and more terrified than I'd felt in years. Something between us had shifted, something I couldn't take back. And as much as I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, deep down, I knew I didn't want to stop. The heart is a fragile thing, I knew that better than anyone. After years of carefully guarding myself, of keeping the world at arm's length, I thought I'd become untouchable, immune to feelings that could break me again. But standing in the gallery that night, with Ethan's hand warm against mine and his eyes locked on me, I felt my walls crumble. It wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to let it happen. But it did. The following evening, I stayed late at the gallery. Ethan texted me earlier in the day to ask if he could stop by after hours. He claimed he needed to grab some notes he'd left behind, but I knew better. I could have said no. I could have told him to come back tomorrow during regular hours to keep things professional. But I didn't. When he arrived, the gallery was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights. I was sitting at my desk in the back office, pretending to be busy with paperwork. My hands were shaking slightly as I heard the door click shut behind him. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice low and tentative. I looked up, forcing a smile. "Did you find what you needed?" He nodded, stepping closer. "I did." But I think there's something else we need to talk about. My chest tightened. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blouse to keep my hands busy. Ethan, I don't think this is a good idea. Why not? He asked, his tone gentle but firm. You know why, I said, avoiding his gaze. You're young, and I'm not. This isn't something that can work. Ethan took another step closer, closing the space between us. You keep saying that like it's a fact, but what if it's not? What if it can work? His words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I wanted to believe him, to let myself imagine a world where we could be together without consequences, but the voice in my head wouldn't let me. It's not that simple, I whispered. It could be, he said, his voice softening. If you let it. Before I could respond, he reached out and touched my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, like electricity. Laura, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I know you're scared, I am too. But this, whatever this is between us, it's real, and I don't want to walk away from it without knowing if we have a chance. I looked up at him then, and for the first time I let myself really see him, not just as the bright, talented intern who worked at my gallery, but as a man. A man who made me laugh, who challenged me, who looked at me like I was the most important person in the world. I don't want to walk away either, I admitted, my voice trembling. Ethan's expression softened and he took another step closer. I could feel the warmth of his body now, the faint scent of his cologne filling the space between us. Then don't, he said simply. The moment he kissed me, it was like the rest of the world faded away. His lips were soft and warm, hesitant at first, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into him, letting myself get lost in the feeling of his arms wrapping around me. For the first time in years, I felt alive. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the gallery. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something that made my heart ache in the best way. When we finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against mine, his hands still gently holding my waist. Tell me this doesn't feel right, he murmured. I couldn't. That night, I let myself be selfish. Ethan and I didn't leave the gallery right away. Instead, we sat together on the old leather couch in the back office, sharing stories and secrets in the dim light of a single lamp. He told me about his childhood, about how he'd fallen in love with art after a middle school teacher took him to a museum for the first time. I told him about my divorce, about the loneliness I'd carried with me ever since. We talked for hours, and with every word, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. By the time we finally said goodnight, it was past midnight. Ethan walked me to my car, his hand resting lightly on my lower back. He didn't kiss me again, but the look in his eyes was enough to leave me breathless. The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally opened a door I'd been afraid to touch, but another part of me felt the crushing weight of reality. This wasn't a fairy tale. Ethan and I couldn't exist in a bubble forever. At some point, we'd have to face the world, with all its judgments and consequences. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him, his smile, his laugh, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I was falling for him. And there was no denying it anymore. That evening, Ethan texted me. Can I see you tonight? My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen. I knew I should say no, that I should put some distance between us before things got even more complicated, but I didn't want distance. Come by the gallery at 8, I replied. When he arrived, the gallery was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. I let him in, my heart racing as he stepped inside. Neither of us said a word as we moved toward each other, the silence between us thick with anticipation. When he kissed me again, it was different this time. More certain, more intense. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. We moved together like we'd been waiting for this moment forever. Every touch igniting something I thought I'd lost. In that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was him. Once you cross a line, there's no going back. I thought about that a lot in the days that followed. I told myself I'd stop, that this was just a moment of weakness. But I didn't stop. Instead, I let myself fall. After that night in the gallery, Ethan and I became something more. We didn't label it, didn't talk about what it meant or where it was going. But every stolen glance, every quiet touch told me the truth. I couldn't imagine my life without him anymore. We were careful, at least at first. During the day we kept our distance, slipping back into the rhythm of boss and intern. But when the gallery emptied out and the world fell silent, we found each other. Those moments became the anchor of my days. It didn't matter how chaotic the world felt, how many doubts whispered in the back of my mind. When I was with Ethan, everything else disappeared. One evening, a week after our first kiss, Ethan invited me to his apartment. He lived in a small, modest space near the university, a tiny one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and stacks of art books lining every available surface. "It's not much," he said as I stepped inside, his voice tinged with nervousness. "It's perfect," I replied, and I meant it. There was something so him about the place, unpolished and full of life. We sat on his couch, sharing a bottle of wine as we talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his plans to apply to graduate school, his dreams of traveling to Europe to study the great masters. I listened, enraptured, feeling a warmth in my chest I hadn't felt in years. When he kissed me, it wasn't hurried or desperate. It was slow and deliberate, like he wanted to savor every second. And I let him. That night, I stayed with him. For the first time in years, I felt unguarded, like I could let someone see every part of me, flaws, fears, and all. When the morning sun filtered through the curtains, I woke up in his arms, his breath warm against my neck. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this could last forever. But reality was never far behind. The next day at the gallery, the world felt sharper, more fragile. Every interaction felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Ethan tried to keep things normal, but I could see the way his gaze lingered on me when no one else was looking. It thrilled me and terrified me in equal measure. I started to notice the little things, the way the other interns glanced at us when we worked together, the way a client's polite smile lingered just a second too long. It was paranoia, I told myself. No one could possibly know. But the weight of the secret pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe. One weekend, Ethan convinced me to leave the city with him. "There's an art fair upstate," he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "It's small, but there are some amazing local artists there. I think you'd love it." I hesitated. "You don't think people will talk?" "Laura," he said, taking my hand in his. "No one's gonna care. It's just you and me. That's all that matters." I wanted to believe him, so I said yes. The drive upstate was beautiful. Winding roads lined with trees that had just started to change colors, their leaves a kaleidoscope of orange and red. Ethan played music from his phone, a mix of classic rock and indie bands I'd never heard of. "Do you always listen to this?" I teased, raising an eyebrow as a particularly loud guitar riff filled the car. He grinned. "What can I say? I have great taste." We laughed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The art fair was everything Ethan had promised. Dozens of small booths were scattered across a grassy field, each one filled with paintings, sculptures, and handmade crafts. Ethan and I wandered through the stalls, stopping to admire pieces that caught our attention. He was in his element, chatting easily with the artists and asking thoughtful questions about their work. I couldn't help but smile as I watched him. He had a way of lighting up a room, of making everyone around him feel important. For a few hours it felt like we were just another couple, no secrets, no complications, just two people who cared about each other. But the illusion didn't last. As we stood at one of the booths admiring a series of abstract landscapes, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Laura?" I froze, my heart plummeting. When I turned, I saw her. Marcy Allen, one of my oldest friends and a frequent visitor to the gallery. She was standing a few feet away, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Marcy," I said, forcing a smile, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her gaze shifting to Ethan, who was standing awkwardly beside me. "This is Ethan," I said quickly. "He's one of our interns. We thought it'd be good to check out the fair for some inspiration." Marcy raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. Ethan extended a hand, his smile polite. "Nice to meet you." "You too," Marcy said, though her tone was laced with suspicion. After Marcy walked away, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. "She knows," I whispered, my voice shaking. She doesn't know anything, Ethan said, placing a reassuring hand on my back. Even if she suspects something, what's she going to do? You're allowed to have a life, Laura. But his words did little to calm me. Marcy was well connected in the art community, and I knew how quickly rumors could spread. If she decided to talk, it wouldn't take long for word to reach the wrong people. And then what? That night, back at Ethan's apartment, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with every possible worst-case scenario. Ethan's arm was draped over me, his breath steady and comforting, but even his presence couldn't quiet the storm in my head. I wanted to believe that we could make this work, that the world wouldn't tear us apart. But the doubts were growing louder, and I didn't know how much longer I could ignore them. Secrets have a way of slipping out, no matter how tightly you try to hold them in. I had been fooling myself, thinking that Ethan and I could exist in our little bubble forever. After that encounter with Marcy at the art fair, it was like a clock had started ticking. I spent the next few days bracing myself for the inevitable. At first, nothing seemed to change. Marcy hadn't called or dropped by the gallery, and I told myself that maybe I was overreacting. But there was a tension in the air now, a weight that settled over me every time I walked through the gallery doors. Ethan noticed. "You've been quiet lately," he said one afternoon as we worked side by side hanging a new series of paintings. "I'm fine," I lied. He gave me a long look, the kind that made me feel like he could see straight through me. "Laura, if this is about what happened at the fair..." "It's not," I cut him off quickly. "I just have a lot on my mind." He didn't press me, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The breaking point came a few days later. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and I was alone in the gallery, going over invoices at my desk. The sound of the front door opening startled me, and when I looked up, my heart dropped. Marcy. She walked in with the kind of confidence only someone holding a secret can carry, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she approached my desk. "Laura," she said with a tight smile, "I've been meaning to stop by." I set down my pen, my hands trembling slightly. "Marcy, what brings you here?" She leaned against the edge of my desk, her eyes narrowing. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Something I saw at the art fair." My stomach twisted. "What about it?" I couldn't help but notice how close you and that intern of yours seemed. Her tone was casual, but the implication was anything but. I forced a laugh, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ethan's a hard worker. I wanted to show him the ropes." Marcy tilted her head, her smile sharp. It looked like more than that to me. There it was, the accusation I'd been dreading. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My silence was enough of an answer. "Laura," she said softly, leaning closer, "I'm not here to judge, but people talk. You know that as well as I do. If you're not careful, this could blow up in your face." That night, I told Ethan what had happened. We were sitting on his couch, the weight of Marcy's words still pressing down on me. Ethan listened quietly, his jaw tightening as I recounted the conversation. "She's not going to stay quiet," I said, my voice trembling. "It's only a matter of time before everyone knows." "Then let them know," Ethan said firmly. I stared at him, stunned. "What?" "I'm not ashamed of us, Laura," he said. "And you shouldn't be either. If people want to talk, let them. It doesn't change how I feel about you." His words should have comforted me, but they didn't. All I could think about was how much I had to lose. "It's not that simple," I whispered. Ethan reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "It can be if you let it." But it wasn't simple. The rumors started small, just whispers in the art community at first. A knowing glance here, a hushed conversation there. Then came the emails, anonymous messages sent to the gallery's account, filled with thinly veiled accusations. They didn't name Ethan outright, but the implication was clear. "You need to end this," Marcy said when she called me a week later, "before it ruins you." Her words echoed in my head long after the call ended. The worst came when David, my ex-husband, showed up at the gallery. I hadn't seen him in months, and the sight of him standing in the doorway made my chest tighten. "David," I said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" He didn't return the smile. Instead, he stepped inside, his expression cold. "I've been hearing things, Laura. Things about you and some kid who works here." I felt the blood drain from my face. "It's none of your business." It is when it affects our family's reputation, he shot back. There is no our family, I said sharply. We've been divorced for 5 years. That doesn't mean people won't associate your actions with me, he said, his voice rising. Do you have any idea how this makes you look? How it makes me look? His words cut deep, not because I cared about his reputation, but because they forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. Ethan and I weren't just a secret anymore. We were a scandal waiting to explode. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the glass of wine in my hand. Ethan had called earlier, but I hadn't answered. I didn't know what to say to him. I cared about him more than I could put into words, but caring wasn't enough to shield us from the world. Something had to give. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every step I took with Ethan brought us closer to a fall I wasn't sure we could survive. I avoided Marcy, ignored David's calls, and tried to focus on the gallery. But the tension was suffocating. Ethan noticed. You're pulling away from me, he said one evening as we sat in his apartment. I'm trying to protect you, I replied. From what? He demanded. From people who don't understand? From your ex-husband and his ego? Laura, none of that matters. What matters is us. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could be enough. But doubt had planted its roots deep, and I couldn't shake it. The breaking point came when an email arrived at the gallery. This time addressed directly to me. If you don't end this, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. There was no name, no signature, just a threat hanging over my head like a guillotine. That night, I called Ethan and told him we needed to talk. We met at the gallery after hours, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me as I unlocked the door. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice breaking. Ethan stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. What are you saying? I'm saying it's over, I said, tears streaming down my face. Us, it's too much. I can't keep pretending that the world won't tear us apart. He stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached for me. Laura, don't do this. Don't let them win. It's not about them, I whispered. It's about you. You have your whole life ahead of you, Ethan. You don't need someone like me holding you back. You're not holding me back, he said fiercely. You're the only person who's ever made me feel alive. His words broke something inside me, but I held firm. I'm sorry, I said, pulling away. I love you, but I can't do this. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Ethan left the gallery, his internship ending abruptly. I didn't see him again, though I thought about him every day. The rumors eventually faded, and life went on. But I felt like I was living in grayscale, the color gone from my world. Then, one day, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a single note, written in Ethan's familiar handwriting. I'll never stop caring about you. Thank you for showing me what love can be. As I read those words, I realized something. Even if our time together was brief, it was real. And that was enough. Do you always let your seatbelt do the driving? Ryan's teasing voice broke the silence in the driveway as he leaned against the passenger door of my car, a crooked grin playing on his lips. I looked up from the driver's seat, where I had been battling a stubborn seatbelt that refused to budge. Very funny, I said dryly, tugging at the strap again. It's stuck. I've been trying to fix it for 10 minutes. Ryan chuckled, his dark eyes sparkling with amusement. Move over, he said, opening the door and motioning for me to scoot back. Let me handle this before you injure yourself. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted him so close. But the seatbelt wasn't going to fix itself, and Ryan had a knack for solving problems with an ease that always managed to make me feel both grateful and mildly annoyed. Fine, I said, sliding back slightly. But be careful, it's... Before I could finish, he ducked into the car, his body leaning over mine as he reached for the seatbelt. The space between us evaporated in an instant. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy and clean, wrapping around me. His arm brushed against my shoulder as he worked to free the jammed buckle, and I held my breath, suddenly hyper-aware of every inch of him. There's your problem, he muttered, his voice low as he tugged at the strap. His face was inches from mine, and when he glanced at me, his eyes met mine in a moment that felt far longer than it should have. You okay? He asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. I nodded quickly, looking away. Just... Just hurry up. Ryan smirked but didn't say anything, his focus shifting back to the seatbelt. After a few more seconds, he freed it with a triumphant click. There, he said, sitting back slightly but still close enough that I could feel his presence. Good as new. Thanks, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't move right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable but charged with something I couldn't quite name. My heart was racing, and I hated how much I wanted to stay in that moment, how much I wanted to let myself lean into him. But I didn't. Shouldn't we get going? I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone as I glanced at the clock. Ryan blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, and nodded. Yeah, let's go. The car ride was quieter than usual. Ryan usually filled the silence with stories about his day, or playful banter that never failed to make me laugh. But tonight, he seemed distracted, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I was afraid of what he might say. Afraid of what it might mean. So instead, I stared out the window, pretending not to notice the way his eyes flicked toward me every so often, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. By the time we reached the family gathering, the tension between us had settled into an uneasy truce. Ryan opened my door for me, his hand brushing mine as he helped me out of the car. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark up my arm that I couldn't ignore. Thanks, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. Anytime. As we walked toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I wasn't ready to face. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment in the car over and over again. The way his arm had brushed against mine, the warmth of his body so close to mine, the intensity in his eyes when he looked at me. It was all too much. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a simple act of kindness. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. Ryan didn't stay away for long. The morning after the family gathering, I was in the middle of tidying up the living room when I heard a knock at the door. My heart jumped, a silly reaction, really. But I couldn't deny the thrill that ran through me when I opened the door to find him standing there, a confident grin on his face. Good morning, he said, holding up a paper bag. Thought you might like some coffee. Good morning, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. You didn't have to do that. He shrugged, stepping inside as if he belonged there. I was driving by anyway. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, taking the coffee he handed me. I wasn't sure why he'd stopped by so early, or why my chest felt tight with both anticipation and unease. Ryan didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. He settled onto the couch, stretching out like he owned the place, and gestured for me to sit down. So, what's on your agenda today? He asked, his tone casual. Just some cleaning, I replied, sitting down across from him. The usual. You should let me help, he said, leaning forward. I don't need help, I said quickly. Maybe not, he said, his voice softening. But you don't always have to do everything on your own. There was something in his tone, something gentle but firm, that made my chest tighten. I looked away, focusing on the coffee cup in my hands. I'm fine, Ryan, I said quietly. Are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard, and when I looked up, his eyes were steady on mine. There was no teasing in his expression, no hint of the playful charm he usually carried. He looked serious, concerned. I'm fine, I repeated, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Ryan leaned back on the couch, his gaze never leaving mine. You know you can talk to me, right? He said after a moment. I know, I replied, my voice softer now. Good, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Because I'm not going anywhere. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that left me momentarily speechless. I nodded, unable to think of anything to say, and sipped my coffee to hide the sudden flush in my cheeks. As the morning turned into afternoon, Ryan stayed. He helped me sort through some old boxes in the attic, joking about the dusty knickknacks we found, and making me laugh more than I had in weeks. At one point, as we both reached for the same box, his hand brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, but the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I glanced at him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. "Sorry," he said softly, though he didn't pull his hand away immediately. "It's okay," I said quickly, stepping back to put some distance between us. But the moment lingered, the air between us charged with something unspoken. Later, as we sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea, Ryan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "it's nice being here with you." I glanced at him, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said with a shrug. I feel like I can be myself when I'm here, like I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not." His words struck a chord in me, and I felt my chest tighten. "That's a good thing," I said softly. "Yeah," he said, his gaze shifting to mine. "It is." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence between us filled with something I couldn't quite name. When Ryan finally left that evening, the house felt quieter than it had in a long time. I stood by the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the driveway, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between us. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Ryan wasn't just my late husband's son anymore. He was Ryan, kind, charming, and attentive, in a way that made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, I couldn't ignore the way he made me feel. Alive. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. Ryan kept finding reasons to stop by, bringing groceries I didn't ask for, fixing things around the house that didn't really need fixing, and staying just long enough to make my heart race every time he was near. He had a way of filling the silence with easy conversation, his voice a warm and steady presence that made the house feel less empty. But it was the moments between the words, the lingering glances, the way his hand would brush against mine, the way he stood just a little too close, that made it impossible for me to ignore what was happening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. He was just being kind, attentive, the way he always had been. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, Ryan called me from the driveway. "I'm outside," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "Thought you might want to go for a drive." "A drive?" I asked, surprised. "Yeah," he said. "It's a nice night, clear skies, we could head out to the lake." I hesitated, but the idea of sitting alone in the house felt unbearable. "Give me 5 minutes," I said, hanging up before I could overthink it. The drive to the lake was quiet at first. The radio played softly in the background, and Ryan's hands gripped the steering wheel, as if he were holding on to something much heavier than the car. When we reached the lake, he pulled off onto a small dirt road that led to a secluded spot by the water. The moon hung low in the sky, its light reflecting off the surface of the lake in shimmering ripples. Ryan turned off the engine and leaned back in his seat, staring out at the water. "I used to come here with Dad," he said softly. "We'd fish, sit by the fire. It was peaceful." I nodded, my chest tightening at the mention of his father. "He loved this place," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "So did you," he said. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, and I felt my breath hitch. I turned away, staring out at the lake, but I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unyielding. After a while, Ryan got out of the truck and walked toward the water. I followed, the cool night air brushing against my skin as I stepped onto the soft grass. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the lake. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "About what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "About you," he said simply. My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "Ryan, I know what you're going to say," he said, stepping closer. "That it's complicated, that it's wrong, but I don't care." I turned to face him, my breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "You should care," I said, my voice trembling. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Because other people might not understand? Because it doesn't fit into some neat little box?" "Yes," I said, though the word felt hollow even as I spoke it. Ryan reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes, my chest tightening as I tried to find the strength to deny it, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Yes, I admitted, my voice cracking. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and electric. Ryan stepped closer, his free hand brushing against my cheek, and I felt my defenses crumble. Then stop fighting it, he said softly. Before I could think better of it, his lips met mine in a kiss that was equal parts tender and urgent. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him, the world around us fading into nothingness. For a moment, there was no guilt, no doubt, no fear. Only the warmth of his touch, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, and the overwhelming sense of being alive. When we finally pulled away, I was breathless, my hands gripping his arms as if to steady myself. Ryan rested his forehead against mine, his hand still holding me as if he were afraid to let go. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Maybe," he said, his lips brushing against my temple. "But it's real." His words sent a shiver through me, and I knew he was right. It was real, terrifyingly, undeniably real. The drive back was quieter than the drive out. Ryan kept his hand on the gear shift, his fingers occasionally brushing against mine. Every time it happened, my heart skipped a beat, but I didn't pull away. When we reached my house, he walked me to the door, his hand resting lightly on my back. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his gaze searching mine. I nodded, though my thoughts were anything but calm. "I'll see you tomorrow?" He smiled, the kind of smile that made my chest ache. "You couldn't stop me if you tried." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hands had felt on my skin. The way his voice had sounded when he said my name. The way he had looked at me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered. It was dangerous. It was wrong. But it was also the most alive I had felt in years. The next evening, Ryan showed up unannounced. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner. The house quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, his hair slightly tousled from the wind, I felt that same familiar jolt in my chest. "You didn't call," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't think I needed to," he replied, his voice calm but with an undertone that sent a shiver through me. He carried a bottle of wine, holding it up with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought you might want some company." I hesitated, my fingers tightening on the edge of the door. But the truth was, I didn't want to be alone. Not tonight. "I'll grab some glasses," I said, leading him into the kitchen. We sat in the living room, the bottle of wine between us on the coffee table. Ryan poured the first glass for me, his movements slow and deliberate. The way he looked at me as he handed it over made my pulse quicken. What are we toasting to?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He leaned back on the couch, his glass in hand, and gave me a small, knowing smile. "To honesty," he said simply. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his gaze. "Honesty," I repeated, raising my glass. We drank in silence for a while, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on anything but him, the ticking clock, the faint sound of the wind outside, but it was impossible to ignore the tension building between us. "You're quiet tonight," he said, breaking the silence. "I'm just tired," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't true. "Liar," he said softly, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "Ryan?" "Don't," he interrupted gently. "Don't push me away." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly, and when I looked at him, the vulnerability in his expression undid me. "I'm not trying to push you away," I said quietly. "I just don't know what to do with this." "This?" he repeated, leaning forward. "What is this, Linda? Tell me." I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But the way he looked at me, patient and unyielding, made it impossible to deny what we both already knew. "It's something I can't ignore," I admitted finally. "Then don't," he said simply. Before I could think better of it, he reached across the space between us, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shockwave through me, and I felt my breath hitch as his thumb traced slow circles over my knuckles. "You're allowed to want this," he said softly. "To want me." The raw honesty in his words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned forward, my lips capturing his in a kiss that was hesitant at first but quickly deepened. Ryan didn't hesitate. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself give in completely. The world around us faded into nothingness, leaving only the heat of his touch, the softness of his lips, and the overwhelming sense of being alive. Somehow, we ended up in my bedroom. I couldn't remember how we got there, only the way his hands moved over me, with a reverence that made my heart ache. He paused for a moment, his forehead resting against mine as he whispered, "Are you sure?" I nodded, my hands gripping his shirt as if to anchor myself. "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. What followed was a blur of warmth and connection, every touch and kiss weaving a tapestry of intimacy that left no room for doubt. Ryan was patient, attentive, and the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world, made tears prick at the corners of my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly, deeply seen. Afterward, we lay tangled together under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Ryan's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. "I think so," I said, though my mind was a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't yet name. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, his lips brushing against my temple. "Just know that I'm here. No matter what." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I closed them tightly, trying to hold on to the moment for as long as I could. But as the first light of dawn crept into the room, reality began to settle over me. The weight of what we had done pressed down on me like a stone, and I couldn't ignore the questions that began to swirl in my mind. When Ryan stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open, he smiled softly, his hand brushing against my cheek. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. He seemed to sense my unease, his smile fading as his gaze searched mine. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Later, as I stood by the window watching him drive away, the house felt quieter than it ever had before. I wrapped my arms around myself, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin. I knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of that realization was almost suffocating. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was something else. A flicker of hope, fragile but insistent. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new. Something terrifying. Something wonderful. The day after, I couldn't focus. My hands trembled as I folded the laundry, the feel of Ryan's touch still vivid against my skin. Every room in the house seemed to echo with his presence, and my mind replayed every moment from the night before. I had crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. And while a part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, the weight of guilt and uncertainty pressed down on me like a stone. When my phone buzzed on the counter, I jumped, nearly dropping the shirt I was holding. "Ryan, can I see you later?" I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to say no, to give myself time to think, to breathe, but the thought of him, of the way he had looked at me, made it impossible to resist. Okay." He arrived that evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression calm but serious. "Hi," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hi," he replied, his voice equally quiet. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally Ryan broke it. "Are you okay?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I feel conflicted." "I get that," he said, stepping closer. "But I don't regret it. Not for a second." His honesty made my chest tighten and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "Ryan, this is so complicated," I whispered. "Only if we let it be," he said, his voice steady. We sat down on the couch, and Ryan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking." I hesitated, my hands twisting together in my lap. "I'm scared," I admitted finally. "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of everything," I said, my voice breaking. "Of what people will think, of what this means, of losing you." "You're not gonna lose me," he said firmly, his hand covering mine. "I'm here, Linda. I'm not going anywhere." The certainty in his voice made tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "How can you be so sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I know what I want," he said simply. "And I want you." Before I could respond, Ryan reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was so gentle, so full of tenderness, that it made my breath catch. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said softly. But you don't have to push me away either. His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his. I don't know how to do this, I whispered. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice steady. Together. When his lips met mine, the kiss was slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to reassure me without words. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself give in completely. The world outside faded into nothingness, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. We moved together like we had the night before, but this time it felt different, more deliberate, more certain. Every kiss, every touch, was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to carry the weight of my doubts by myself. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Ryan's arm was draped over my shoulders, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting against his chest. I think so, I said, though my mind was still a whirlwind of emotions. You don't have to be scared, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. We'll take it one step at a time. His words were meant to comfort me, but the weight of what we'd done was impossible to ignore. The days that followed were a mix of quiet moments and unspoken tension. Ryan continued to visit, his presence a constant reassurance. But as comforting as it was to have him near, I couldn't shake the fear that lingered in the back of my mind. What would happen if someone found out? What would people say? One evening, as we sat on the porch, Ryan turned to me, his expression serious. I've been thinking, he said. About what? I asked, my chest tightening. About us, he said. About what this means. I looked away, my fingers twisting together in my lap. It's not that simple, Ryan, I said softly. It can be, he said, if we let it be. His words stayed with me, long after he left that night. I knew he was right, that the only thing standing in our way was my fear. But letting go of that fear felt impossible, like stepping off the edge of a cliff, without knowing if there would be anything to catch me. The next time Ryan came over, he didn't bring groceries or a toolbox. He brought a question. What do you want, Linda? He asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Not what you think you're supposed to want. What do you actually want? The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. I looked at him, my chest tightening as I tried to find the words. I don't know, I admitted finally. Then figure it out, he said, his hand covering mine. Because I'm not going anywhere. And I'll wait as long as it takes. As he left that night, I stood by the window, watching his truck disappear down the driveway. The house felt quieter than ever, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I couldn't keep running from the truth. The morning after Ryan's visit, I woke to a quiet house. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt warmer than usual, but it did little to ease the heaviness in my chest. His question from the night before echoed in my mind. What do you actually want? For years, I had lived my life according to the expectations of others. First as Bill's wife, then as the stepmother who kept the family together after his passing. But in Ryan's gaze, in his words, I saw a challenge to break free from those constraints. The problem was, I didn't know if I had the courage to take the leap. I spent the day busying myself with household chores, trying to avoid the inevitable spiral of doubt and fear that loomed over me. But the memories of the last week kept creeping in. The way Ryan's hands felt when they brushed against mine, the softness in his voice when he reassured me, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had reached a breaking point. I couldn't live in limbo anymore. I picked up my phone and dialed Ryan's number. He answered after the first ring. Linda? His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Can you come over? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said without hesitation. True to his word, Ryan arrived quickly. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes searching mine. What's wrong? He asked, his voice steady but gentle. Nothing, I said softly, stepping back to let him in. I needed to see you. Relief washed over his face, and he nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. I'm here. We moved to the living room, where he sat beside me on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. The closeness felt comforting, grounding, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan turned to face me fully, his gaze intent. And you're right," I admitted, my throat tightening. "I've spent so much time worrying about what other people think about what's right and wrong that I've forgotten to ask myself what I actually want." His hand found mine, his fingers lacing through mine in a gesture so simple, yet so profound that it made my chest ache. "And what do you want?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "I want this," I said, my voice trembling. "I want you. But I'm scared, Ryan. I don't know how to do this." "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Together." For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of my confession settling between us. Then, Ryan leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine. "You're not alone," he whispered. "You don't have to do this alone." The tears I had been holding back spilled over, and I closed my eyes, letting the weight of his words wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I could let go of the guilt, the fear, the expectations. When I opened my eyes, Ryan was watching me, his expression open and unguarded. "I'll follow your lead," he said softly. "Whatever you decide, I'm here." That night, as we sat together on the couch, I realized that the answer to Ryan's question had been there all along. What I wanted wasn't just him. It was the freedom to live my life on my terms, to embrace the love that had been quietly growing between us, no matter how unconventional it might seem. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. A week later, Ryan suggested we take a weekend trip, just the two of us. "A fresh start," he called it, his eyes bright with hope. I hesitated at first, the weight of my doubts still lingering. But as I looked at him, at the steady reassurance in his gaze, I felt a flicker of courage. "Okay," I said finally. His smile was immediate, and the way he pulled me into his arms made my heart feel lighter than it had in years. The day we left for the trip, I stood by the window, watching as Ryan loaded the car. The house was quiet behind me, but for the first time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. As I stepped outside, the sunlight warmed my skin, and I felt a sense of hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Ryan held the car door open for me, his smile soft but full of promise. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, my chest tightening with both anticipation and a sense of possibility. "Let's go," I said, stepping into the car and buckling my seatbelt. This time I didn't need him to fix it for me.